monetize the streams and get revenue from that. Woot woot. All right, with that, we are live. Hello, all the humans. Welcome to the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix Sunday Speaker event. Please hit the like button and subscribe to get more of our awesome content, or better yet, become a member of HSGP and volunteer for something that fills you with joy. Today's presentation aligns with the values of humanism with responsibility, global awareness, and critical thinking. Responsibility, and every day each of us make choices. These choices, large and small, all have consequences for ourselves and for the world around us. Moral responsibility involves taking conscious ownership of one's intentions and actions and being accountable for the resulting consequences. Global awareness. We live in a world that is rich in cultural, social, and individual diversity, a world with rapidly increasing interdependence. As a result, events anywhere are more likely to have consequences everywhere. And critical thinking. As we are each bombarded with a constant stream of information, it can become a challenge to decide what is accurate and true. Thinking critically allows us to make sense of all of this information and reason our way to good judgments and effective solutions to the problems we face, while rigorously avoiding pitfalls like rationalization, conformity, and stereotyping. Today, we have Candace Rondeaux with The Gospel According to Q, How the New Right Came to Worship at the Altar of a Viral Conspiracy Theory. Candace directs Future Frontlines, a public intelligence service for next generation security and democratic resilience. A journalist and public policy analyst, she is a professor of practice and fellow at the Melican Center for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies and the Center on the Future of War at Arizona State University. She is a columnist for the World Politics Review and a contributing writer for The Daily Beast. Catalyzing the global human pursuit of dignity, justice, equity, transparency, and accountability is a line throughout all her work. Before joining New America, Rondeaux served as Senior Program Officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she launched the Resolve Network, a global research consortium on conflict and violent extremism, as a strategic director to the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. She has documented and analyzed political violence in South Asia and around the world for the Washington Post and the International Crisis Group. Before going abroad for the Post in 2009, Rondeaux covered criminal justice in Maryland and Virginia, where she covered capital punishment and was part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team of Post reporters who covered the 2007 Virginia Tech massacre. In 2004, while on a reporting sabbatical from covering criminal justice in Florida for the St. Petersburg Times, she reported on energy security issues in the Caucasus as an international reporting fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She holds a BA in Russian Area Studies from Sarah Lawrence College in Massachusetts, in journalism from the New York University, and in journalism from the New York University, and a MPP in public policy from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Please give a big HSGP welcome to Candace Rondeaux. Candace.
Oh, thanks so much, Ron. Thanks also to everybody who helped put this together. I first got the outreach from Roxanne, a couple months ago now, and I'm really excited that we're finally at this moment. And I'm also really excited to learn about everything the Humanist Society is doing in Arizona right now, a place that I travel to, relatively frequently, in my connection as a professor at Arizona State University, but a place I also don't know that well. So it's great to hear you guys are up to so much good. So I thought I would share a few slides and try and sort of talk through the kind of origin stories of QAnon. Many of you may be familiar with QAnon from our recent coverage of the January 6th insurrection. I think I'll talk a little bit about that, but first let me bring up these slides. Hopefully this will work so I can kind of walk through this logically. I should probably say a little something about sort of how all this got started, but truth be told, I don't think any of us would be here talking about QAnon if it hadn't been for the events of January 6th here in Washington. As it happens, I actually live about 10 blocks away from the Capitol building here on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And I was present at the time of the attacks. I saw kind of the stream of different types of supporters of the Trump administration arriving in my neighborhood, days before the assault on the Capitol. And so it has both a kind of professional and personal resonance for me, kind of what happened that day. Part of what I'm going to talk about today is the result of a collaboration between a working group of researchers who span the globe, really, including Ireland, California, Washington, and so forth, who all kind of answered the call on the day, on January 6th, to collect as much social media as possible from the event as it was unfolding. And that call was part of a group of journalists and activists who are trying to track the impact of social media on political violence, as well as the impact of disinformation on kind of how we experience the world. So with that said, let me just give you a brief overview of what we're going to try and cover today. And I hope to leave some room in here for Q&A, but I want to talk about the origin story of QAnon and give you a little bit of background over the next 25 minutes about their ideology, the movement's ideology, some of its influences, some of the motivations of the QAnon followers as we know them today, and then some of the implications for the outlook in the United States in terms of political stability, but also potentially, some of the implications for how the world views the United States and how the world interacts with this social movement. So let's start with what QAnon is. What is QAnon? Where did it come from? QAnon is really a dynamic conspiracy theory that has continuously evolved since it first appeared in October 2017. Today, it constitutes a global movement of millions of people around the world. But it really got its start on kind of part of the internet subculture known as image boards, which are these sort of very kind of low budget points of exchange on a singular website. This particular phenomenon started on a website called 4chan, which is still operable. At the time was very popular with anime and manga fans, people who sort of like Japanese comics, and also very big with gamers, but most significantly very big with the far right. A number of different far right operatives, as well as organizations, exchange memes and comments and do what's called shit posting online on 4chan. And in actual fact, QAnon was preceded by a number of different anons. All of the posters on 4chan are anonymous. So anon is just short for anonymous. There was FBI anon, there was CIA anon, and other types of anon political conspiracy theory threads that were popular but never quite took off. And QAnon combined parts of a conspiracy theory that we all now know as Pizzagate, which involved, a kind of spurious theory, a very spurious theory, drawn from the WikiLeaks documents taken from the Democratic National Convention and posted online, and emails between John Podesta, who was, of course, a chief advisor to the DNC, and a bunch of other folks in the DNC. And it was from that origin, from the WikiLeaks data dump, that this Pizzagate conspiracy theory kind of bubbled up. And the idea was that John Podesta was frequenting a pizza parlor here in Washington, just on the other side of town, called the Comet Ping Pong Pizza place. And that he, whenever referring to Comet Ping Pong, where he would have meetings, because it was close by, I think, to where he lives, he would refer to things like cheese pizza, which was then imputed to be sort of child pornography, right? You will know that, a couple of years later, there was a man who was involved in a shooting at this Comet Ping Pong Pizza restaurant because he happened to be following the Pizzagate conspiracy theory. And he believed that there were children hidden by Hillary Clinton in the basement of this pizza parlor, but there is no basement, actually, as it turns out, in the parlor. So Pizzagate kind of morphed over time and was co-opted by Q. So one of Q's first drops in October 2017 incorporated the Pizzagate conspiracy thread. And from there, it just mushroomed over time. And as you can see here on this sort of very crude, rudimentary timeline, what went from one post in October 2017 became 200 by December 2017, and more, Democratic politicians became kind of the target of the conspiracy theory that was bubbling up online under this QAnon posting. And over time, it mushroomed from 4chan to another board called 8chan, and then moved onto Twitter, Facebook, where it still lives today in its sort of crude format. So what's it all about? What is this QAnon really about? What's the ideology? What's the mythos? So, I mean, it's important to understand that QAnon as a movement has a number of different heroes and villains. One of the, a couple of the chief heroes, of course, are President Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, and former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. These two, and Jesus Christ, and a few other kind of heroic folks, appear regularly in QAnon drops, that is, sort of text posts to 4chan that have been collected over time and become the subject of this movement. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, George Soros, also figure very prominently as villains. The core mythos of QAnon is kind of strange. It will sound strange to anybody who is a non-believer. And the idea is that President Trump was tapped by a secret group of military officers to run for president and take over the White House in order to do battle with a deep state secret cabal of Satan-worshiping child traffickers, of which Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and George Soros are some. And the sort of subtext is that Q, who was believed to be either a military official or an intelligence officer or both, who is very close to the White House, is performing his patriotic duty by back channeling this secret information about Trump's secret war against the deep state to the public, in the hopes that they too will join what is called the storm, which is kind of this apocalyptic moment when the citizens and patriots and followers of QAnon will rise up against the evil cabal and with the encouragement of Donald Trump, restore America to its favored place in the world of nations. So that's the kind of basic mythos. There are other things that kind of go along with this, and we can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. But as you can imagine, this sounds pretty far-fetched, and it's hard to believe in a way that anybody would follow this, let alone millions of people, and that it would lead to a violent insurrection in the nation's capital. So why is that? Why did that happen? Where did it come from? Well, one reason QAnon is so popular and I think has been so successful in its evolution is because it borrows a lot from what are called alternate reality games. Back in, at the edge of when Web 1.0 was turning into Web 2.0, that is when social media became more predominant. So around 2010, 11, 12, one other internet subculture involved the playing of kind of alternate games, assuming roles, essentially. They're called live action role-playing games, where you participate by assuming a role and you're enacting a narrative, essentially. One of the most successful alternate reality games and one of the most mysterious is a game called Cicada 3301. And Cicada 3301, interestingly, there's a movie that just came out about this. It's a fiction film about Cicada 3301. So if you want to check that out, I think it was released earlier this year in March or April, so you can check that out for yourself. So the Cicada 3301 also emerged on 4chan, the same image board where QAnon was born, basically. In October 2012, a cryptic post appears on 4chan, and it appears to be posted by some sort of secret organization that nobody knows anything about. And there's kind of a riddle, a puzzle. And that puzzle leads to a series of puzzles that are, that contain cryptographic clues and hidden passages of information, hidden pathways to different internet sites. And initially, this Cicada 3301 game was thought to be some sort of CIA or NSA recruitment tool. In fact, the message said something to the effect of, we're looking for highly intelligent individuals who can solve these puzzles. Nobody's been able to prove one way or the other whether it was a CIA or NSA recruitment tool, but in any case, that's kind of part of the mythos around Cicada 3301. All but one of the puzzles was solved. It's very complicated. But strangely, unlike the other puzzles that appeared on 4chan, there was one in 2016 that was posted on Twitter. And it is the theory of several disinformation researchers who have been following QAnon and Cicada 3301 was that was the moment when some people who were involved in Cicada 3301, although tangentially, may have decided to try and mainstream this format of kind of cryptographic, esoteric, question and answer, chase games, essentially, kind of a treasure hunt almost online. Several people involved in Cicada 3301 were also involved in propagating the WikiLeaks Pizzagate conspiracy theory, as well as and Pizzagate and so forth and so on. So there is thought to be some sort of tie there, although I think it would take some, considerable work to kind of make a definitive link. But there have been a couple of documentaries that have made this leap, including one on HBO that was released, I think, in June. That's probably worth taking a look at, or actually May. That's worth taking a look at to sort of explore more of that. The reason the Cicada 3301 connection is so important is because it draws on some of the influences and ideas that we see contained in the QAnon posts, and some of the kind of some of the spirit of the ideology underpinning the entire movement. It comes from this sort of cypherpunk alternative reality games world, this kind of hacktivist, WikiLeaks anonymous culture, but also it borrows very heavily from this idea of kind of occult knowledge being embedded and buried in secret texts. It's something that is sort of an old kind of Christian Gnostic concept that dates back to millennia, essentially, and in a way reverses what we kind of understand about what is good and what is evil. It also borrows heavily from what is known as the I Am movement, which is a movement that in the 1930s, that appeared in the 1930s, and kind of evolved out of another philosophy very well known called theosophy, that was essentially promoted by a woman named Helena Blavatsky, a Russian immigrant here in the United States, but also was very central to kind of the rise of Nazism, actually. Theosophy is thought to be kind of the religion of many of the sort of Nazi party leaders. And it's no mistake that there is a lot of crossover between the Theosophy movement, the I Am movement, and what we now know today as QAnon. Some of the things that are kind of common across all three is this belief in sort of a messianic charismatic Christianity, in which real life people of today are prophets, enacting their sort of Christian destiny to save the white race. Also embedded in this ideology and very influential is a lot of anti-Semitism. And I think one of the chief tropes that seems to be repeated throughout the QAnon drops is this kind of anti-Semitic trope, borrowing from the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which in itself was a disinformation operation that came out of the early 1900s in Russia, when Tsarist Russia sought to, expel Jews from parts of a very wealthy part of Western Russia at the time. So there's a lot of interesting crossover points here that are worth kind of exploring, and we can again get into this in greater detail in the Q&A. But important to point out that there's sort of a lot of overlapping cultures involved in the QAnon movement. So who follows Q and why? Well, it turns out a lot of Americans progressively have come to believe more and more in the QAnon phenomenon as a real and viable means of interpreting the world. What we know is that over the last 3 years, there have been a number of different polls, testing out the proposition and asking the question, do you believe that Donald Trump is battling a deep state cabal of Satan worshiping child sex traffickers? And, initially in 2018, the answer from 5% of Americans was, yes, we do believe that. And then in 2019, a subsequent poll found that 10% of Americans believed, in fact, that the QAnon myth. Today, as recently as 2021, there was a poll suggesting that 17% of Americans believe the fundamental core myth promoted by QAnon and its conspiracies. But contrary to popular belief, these people are not uneducated bumpkins. They come from all kinds of backgrounds. Many are college educated, many are wealthy, some are working class and high school graduates, but the vast majority are white and count themselves as Christians. It's not exclusively white. There are, of course, people of color who follow QAnon, but overwhelmingly, Christians, and particularly those who are oriented toward either sort of New Ageism or, evangelical beliefs, tend to have a kind of affinity for some of the ideas contained in QAnon and its ideology. Most are older. The vast majority seem to skew in the baby boomer generation. Many are women. And we know from studying, violent extremist movements in the past, in particular the KKK, the Nazi movement, and others, that women are extremely important to sustaining the viability of these types of movements. And so, something to consider is sort of what that might mean for the future. We also know, of course, that 27 people were arrested at the Capitol breach who said that they were QAnon followers, including, of course, the most famous QAnon shaman, who has appeared on all kinds of photos from the event of January 6th. We also know that there are a lot of people, I think roughly 97 people who ran for office in the 2020 primaries who were avowed followers of QAnon. Two of them now are representatives in Congress and the House. So this is a growing movement. It has a lot of pull politically. And, we're aware that there are others who are now running for office locally at the county level and the city level who may be influential in the 2022 midterms. So what are the implications? Well, first of all, with a movement this size, you have millions of followers around the world. And the conspiracy theory has morphed to some degree to fit with kind of local conditions. So you see some overlapping, targeting, for instance, local Japanese or Netherlands-based politicians and accusing them of child trafficking and suggesting that they too are part of the cabal. It also continues to draw Americans who are deeply enmeshed in the Trump campaign and this promotion of this idea that the elections were rigged and that Joe Biden did not, in fact, win the presidency legally. The FBI, of course, continues to monitor QAnon as a potential terrorist threat and is very concerned about the number, over, I think, 24 violent incidents to which QAnon has been connected in the United States alone. And of course, most importantly, I think, from a long-term perspective, as long as this movement, continues to expand and have, a viability and have dynamism, it is out there for other countries, particularly Russia and China, to weaponize and use to undermine our political institutions in the United States, most importantly, of course, elections. So with that, I'm going to stop here because I'm sure there are lots of questions, and I'm happy to actually just have a conversation.
All righty. If you are interested in asking a question, please go ahead and raise your hand. And I'll go ahead and ask one of my questions while we wait for people to find the raise hand button. Why does this have such a pull politically? Why isn't this just some conspiracy theory? And you mentioned that it's can be weaponized moving forward, which I hadn't considered, but yes, that's absolutely true. But why is it not just another conspiracy theory?
Well, part of the reason is because of the way the posts are formatted. So it kind of uses this idiom of question and answer, and it kind of frames this idea of predicting events in the future. So it's got a kind of almost Nostradamus-like quality, right? And in fact, it borrows very heavily from kind of a quatrain format. It's a little bit enigmatic, right? So people just love mystery, right? I mean, people love mysteries. We watch, police procedurals all the time. So it appeals on some level to just human curiosity, right? But it also plays to already embedded beliefs about, the nature of our political system and how, different actors like Donald Trump fit into it. And on occasion, Q appears to be quite good at predicting the future, but in actual fact, Q often just predicts that Donald Trump will say a thing that he almost always says anyway, right? And so this kind of confirmatory loop, I think, reinforces already extant political biases that are there. And I think the other reason that it's become such a huge political movement, we cannot ignore the role of COVID in increasing the numbers of followers. It is no mistake that we saw an increase in the number of QAnon-related terms appearing on Facebook, Twitter, Parler, which of course is the conservative version of Facebook, or Twitter, I should say. There after the pandemic, which was this documentary, conspiracy theory-based documentary about, the strange origins of COVID. Once that appeared on YouTube, it kind of acted as a reinforcing mechanism for people who were isolated, locked up in their homes, especially a lot of women who were kind of suddenly finding themselves not as relevant or, did not have as much agency over their lives. So part of this is it appeals to people who have a sense that they've lost agency over their day-to-day lives. And it kind of reinforces already pre-existing biases that are very anti-liberal or illiberal in nature.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. First up, we have Roy, then Paul, then Charles. Roy, go ahead.
Well, I'm just wondering, are there any effective countermeasures to convince or expose the fallacies of QAnon and help remove or convince members to quit that organization?
Well, that's a really good question. I think one of the things that we did see very shortly after January 6th, when some of QAnon's predictions about what would happen on the way to the inauguration on January 20th, obviously fell flat. Biden was, in fact, inaugurated and installed in office, despite QAnon's prognosis that, in fact, he wouldn't be. So we did see, as an outcome of those kind of failed predictions, we saw a lot of people sort of dropping out. There's even a Reddit board, a whole thread of ex-QAnon followers, families of QAnon followers who found sort of refuge with each other and solace in trying to figure out how to pull people away from the movement. I mean, I think there are kind of three ways that we have to kind of look at, trying to contain the challenge. One is, of course, just interpersonal interactions. It's really important not to cut people off who have, who ascribe to these beliefs, and to continue in dialogue with them to help them understand that there is a different path. Second, I think it's really important for researchers, and policymakers and practitioners who are really looking at the problem of disinformation to take seriously the fact that we're going to have to keep researching and monitoring and exposing, the origins and the kind of the impacts of QAnon, so that the public understands the dangers. And then for law enforcement officials, it's going to be really key to try and understand, just how this movement is evolving, and kind of get ahead of potential threats as best it can.
So is that a yes, no? We're working on it. And also, what is a Reddit board?
Oh, well, so it's a yes. It can be, I think, dealt with. No, it's not going to be easy. Reddit is a social media platform where people sort of post different issues about their whatever they care about. It could be dogs, it could be cats, it could be QAnon, and they sort of share information about their experiences, sometimes anonymously, sometimes they use their own names.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Roy. Paul, you're next, and then we have Charles. Go ahead.
Yeah, I see this issue as, somebody just hopping on a horse that's already out there. The fact is there is, political people in high office involved in all kinds of things. I mean, you look at the Jeffrey Epstein situation where all the high politicals would go to his island. And in England, there was the Jimmy Savile thing that went on for years and years with, child molestation and all kinds of unsavory things. And a lot of people are looking and seeing nobody addressing this stuff. So when somebody like Q comes along, they say, hey, maybe this guy can help fix the problem. And I think unless society really starts becoming serious in addressing these issues, there's going to be, there will always be this reservoir of frustrated people who see things going on, business as usual, and they'll reach out to something like this and go, well, maybe this is true. Maybe this is a way we can solve our problems. And the fact that maybe these Q guys weren't on the level doesn't mean we don't have to solve these problems. And I think that's where most of our attention should go, is how do we actually address the issues that society has, and address the issues that a government that has so much power. Whenever you have a power disparity, you have people there who have, who will take advantage of it. Power corrupts, absolutely. And, the United States government and other major governments have insane amounts of power these days compared to what they did, back in the revolutionary days, when the people could actually match the armies of other countries and actually win their independence. So anyway, I'm just saying that, I'm not with the Q guys, but at the same time, I understand where the appeal is, and the appeal will always be there as long as people perceive these issues are not being addressed.
Paul, I think you make a very good point on a couple of levels. One, I don't think it's a coincidence that you have many Christians who are following this movement so closely, in particular, sort of charismatic, from charismatic traditions, but also there are quite a few Catholics. I think it's important to note that this phenomenon, is coming on the heels of almost a decade of very intensive reporting on sexual abuse within the church, the Catholic Church, as well as other churches. I think it's certainly created, sort of a psychological crisis, but there's also, it's also important to point out that there's a bit of cognitive dissonance here, right? Because on the one hand, of course, there has not been, I think, a satisfactory answer for widespread reports of sort of child abuse by institutional elites, by wealthy people, right? On the other, right, sort of, I think sort of following kind of a conspiracy-based theory that really doesn't offer much concrete proof also serves to make it very difficult for institutions and individuals to influence the community toward, I think, a more reality-based path and a reality-based answer to the problem of the loss of credibility of so many institutions and leaders around the world.
Thank you, Candace. Next up, we have Charles, and then we're going to do a couple of typed questions, and then we'll get to Jim. So Charles, you're up next.
Candace, I want to say thank you very much for coming here today and giving a great presentation. And I would like to echo, because I came from a small town in upstate New York where homophobia and racism continued on long past the 1960s, 70s until I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, and how so many of the inhabitants who are still living there have subscribed to the QAnon conspiracies. And it's, to me, it sort of rings true from the conspiracies of JFK and others in the past, where it's the uneducated want to be smart. They really want to be smarter than everybody else, at least on something, because for so many years that they've been marginalized as being told, oh, no, you're dumb. Oh, no, you're a farm worker. Oh, no, you're a mechanic. You're not good enough. So in a way, QAnon gives people some power of knowing. And so I can definitely see that being the attraction. And I loved how you said that because women are holding the line with this group, and it's because of the long-term marginalization. It allows them some kind of, they've done their research, so they like to say. But here's my question, Candace, is are we looking at this as a temporary phenomenon of basically the internet coming of age? The internet has a lot more growth to go. It's very, very, very new. When we look at this historically over a period of human civilization, hundreds of years, the internet is just starting. Is this just a part of infancy of growing up? Or is this going to be something that we're going to be dealing with all the time? And if it is going to be doing something that's all the time, how can groups like the Humanist Society maybe have its own dispatches from the future to sort of play ball? This seems to be like, if this is such an effective strategy, should we also be thinking about a similar strategy for thinking about our adherents or getting them excited?
What a great set of questions. Thank you so much for that. I mean, very thought-provoking. So, I think there's like a couple different ways to approach the QAnon phenomenon. One is to sort of treat it as this moment in time in American history in which the president of the United States and insiders close to him have benefited substantially from the amplification of this particular conspiracy theory-based movement. That is a true statement, and it is certainly like sort of one way to kind of focus in on the movement and its meaning. But another way, as you're suggesting, is to kind of understand it in the context of the internet as a technology that is shaping human culture, that is shaping not only American culture and American history and American events, but global events, right? And if you put it in that context, I think it is, certainly it is correct to one, mark it as an evolution in how the web looks today, how we experience it today, how we interact with internet technologies today. And it is also, I think, indicative of, I think, the shape-shifting nature that, the internet will continue to have in terms of influencing political, economic, social outcomes, not only in the United States, but around the world. And you can almost predict in some ways, there are some sort of phenomenon that are already beginning to have influence people are worried about. Example, deep fakes, which are essentially synthetic fake, false videos that seem to represent, real people like Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton saying things, but are actually spliced together through the use of artificial intelligence. There's a great deal of worry this kind of phenomenon can be used, to really motivate all kinds of political action and real action on the ground. A very popular form of deep fakes is actually often targets women, especially well-known women, by placing their heads on the bodies of pornography stars. So again, kind of a targeting of women. So one of the common threads here, though, right, other than the fact that we're kind of talking about the evolution of technology, but a common thread throughout is already extant human biases, either against women or, against people of color or, other marginalized groups are going to find their way into internet culture one way or the other. And the work, policy-wise, particularly for legislators, is to recognize that certain types of disinformation and misinformation can be harmful not only to the body of politic, but to individuals. And so you may know that there is a lawsuit pending by the Dominion voting systems against several members of Trump's inside circle who are QAnon followers and influencers. I think the outcome of that lawsuit for defamation will probably tell us which way the wind is blowing on the future of the internet, and whether QAnon is a flash in the pan, or whether both the courts and the legislatures will recognize that there is going to be some regulation needed in order to constrain the viral growth of conspiracy theories that provoke violence around the world.
I guess as a follow-up, has QAnon peaked? And if it has, how can we be sort of ascertain this as it goes forward, as we go forward, by looking at it on the internet?
I think it's very hard to predict when something like QAnon peaks, right? Because you kind of need to know, like, what was its scale before? And a lot of the work that I'm doing and others who are in this kind of disinformation research space, we're trying to get our heads around, like, how do we explain concretely what is the metric for growth exactly? Like, what do we mean when we say peak, and what do we mean when we say ebb? And what does that look like if there are still millions of people out there using these terms in other platforms? And how do we comparatively measure, for instance, how QAnon terminology is used on Telegram, which is another type of social media application, versus WhatsApp, versus, for instance, Parler, which is kind of this fringe platform. So unfortunately, it's a hard phenomenon to get your arms around without a lot of resources to kind of research the metrics.
Thank you. So Kara and Alice ask, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer these, but I'm going to ask them anyway. Where will Trump's lawsuit against Google go, in your opinion? And how will the Arizona voters' presidential recount affect us?
Well, I mean, I think the current analysis of Trump's lawsuits against Google, and probably in future will be other social media outfits, is that essentially it's more politically motivated than sort of motivated by any kind of genuine sense of legal harm. Citizens United, which is of course the Supreme Court decision that essentially enshrined the idea that companies have free speech rights. And therefore have the ability to exercise, what they will and won't do, and who they will and won't associate with, and how they will do that. I mean, a company like Google, frankly, has no obligation to anybody other than its stakeholders and board managers, essentially. So I don't think that, I think the suits are designed to keep Trump in the news, and to keep alive the big lie narrative around the elections, which has been a tremendous fundraising vehicle, not only for Trump, but others who are aligned with him, who might be running also for statewide office and local offices. Sorry, the second question was?
How will the Arizona voters' presidential recount affect us?
Well, what's sad about the Arizona recount is, again, that's a phenomenon that has been to some degree financed by QAnon followers, right, who follow these various influencers. What's sad about it is that it's not the only one that's taking place. We know, that there's plans afoot to try and revive a challenge in Wisconsin, to again come back to it in Georgia. For Arizona voters in particular, I think you have to be concerned that the midterm elections now may be very hotly contested, and that in fact you will find yourself in a kind of vortex of permanently contested election results that might really linger on until 2024. The only kind of, I think, off-ramp I would see would be somehow, if Trump sort of disappeared from the scene for a variety of reasons. But even then, it seems like a runaway train.
Thank you. Thank you. Alex says, this seems like in a very involved form of game theory, an attempt to play people to get people to play a game while unaware of the game. It draws people through emotion, mystery, and dopamine hits when they figure out a piece of the puzzle. Would the idea that Q draws on common fears and concerns to pull people in be a correct assessment? After all, who would not be concerned about child trafficking?
Yeah, there's been some new research out there. Actually, there's a great book, and I just want to quickly pull it up, by one of my colleagues, Mia Bloom. It's just come out, actually, and it was reviewed in the New York Times, and I've just got it on my Kindle here, so I just want to make sure I have the title right. That's really worth reading. It's called Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of QAnon. And it's really a fascinating look at the psychology, as well as some of the kind of the origin stories. But one of the points in the book that I thought was fascinating was this idea that QAnon in format seems to play on sort of the biases of those who might have a potential for addiction. You find yourself kind of lost and cut off from time because you're trying to connect the dots, do your own research, right? Follow the breadcrumbs, as QAnon says, and sort of put together this conspiracy theory, which, by the way, does contain lots of allusions to JFK Jr.'s death. So, has lots of resonance with what was mentioned earlier. One of the phenomenon of, kind of defining characteristics of a cult or an addiction is that you lose track of time when you're engaging with whatever it is that is the object of your addiction or your obsession. And a lot of post-QAnon followers and defectors who kind of left the movement do describe feeling lost. And that is also true of Cicada 3301, the old alternative reality game I mentioned earlier, that seems to have had a lot of resonance for what we now know as QAnon today. Similar features. Those who ended up following that puzzle really lost themselves and lost track of time. Some people just didn't eat. So it kind of has a dissociative quality, I think, that has a real psychological impact.
Very interesting. Okay. All right. Jim, you are up next. Go ahead. Jim V.
Thanks. I actually posted my question. I missed the first 10 minutes due to some technical issues, but I've been watching this 5-part or 6-part or gazillion-part HBO series. And if you've already answered this, just, I'll catch it later. But man, the original Q, Steve Bannon, is it one of the Watkins? Is it Colonel Flynn? Is it Roger Blaine? Sorry, Roger. Do you have a theory on that?
Yeah, so I've watched both of the documentaries. So there was one on that was produced by Vice a little bit earlier than the HBO one that you're referencing. And you will know from that documentary, of course, that Cicada 3301 is mentioned. A man named Thomas Schoenberger is interviewed in that documentary, and he seems to kind of make the leap somehow that General Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor, is somehow connected. I myself have done a report, and I can share that with you guys, maybe in the chat here, on Michael Flynn and his role or his kind of connections to QAnon, and the ways in which he has benefited from and profited from his connections to QAnon. I think the kind of, most disinformation researchers who are trying to track this and follow this have a kind of common set of assumptions, but there's still disputes about, who's done what when, and there's more work to do. One common assumption is that QAnon is not one person, right? It's probably 5, 6, maybe a dozen people who share the account, and there has been some pretty significant and very solid research suggesting that at some point, in the evolution of QAnon, the text analysis, the kind of linguistics changed, suggesting that there were at least 2 authors who were behind the QAnon drops. Of course, the central theme in the HBO documentary, it features Ron Watkins, who is the son of, the other Watkins.
Jim Watkins.
Sorry, Jim Watkins. Thank you. An American who was based in the Philippines, who is very instrumental in kind of the development of 8chan and 4chan, and so forth and so on. I am not convinced that it was simply a Watkins operation. I do think that there were other folks involved in at least propagating the movement and building it up to what it is today.
Thank you.
Okay. And we have one last question from Susan. What is the fascination with the letter Q? Star Trek has the letter Q as a main adversary, Q and James Bond, and now there's QAnon. Any theories, any relevance to it being there?
Yeah, well, great question. So I failed to mention this, but so Q, the poster claims to have a Q clearance, which is a high-level security clearance for people who work in the nuclear field. So the Department of Energy is in charge of issuing Q clearances for for folks who are dealing with nuclear weapons production in some way or another. You can imagine, right, that a White House insider would probably, have that kind of level of clearance if they're close to the president, who of course has the nuclear football. So that's one answer, but the other is, Q almost automatically, right? We have Q&A. We know that it means question, right? And it signifies mystery and question and answering questions. So I suspect that it's a little bit of both.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. I would encourage you to raise your hand. I'm going to go ahead and ask this. There was a saying, where we go one, we go all. What does that have to do with QAnon? What is that?
Yeah, great question. So I'm glad that you're getting into these kind of granular details. So, and this is where the controversy around General Flynn has now come to kind of a full head. I wrote a little bit about this in the Intercept piece that I did. So General Flynn, his family is actually suing CNN right now for some reporting that they did back in July of 2020, when somebody posted on Twitter a video recording of Flynn with his family members at sort of a poolside with their hands raised, just so, reciting an oath that is very commonly taken by members of Congress and then officers in the military. But they ended it with a very curious phrase, where we go one, we go all, which is tightly nested in kind of QAnon phenomenon. You see it all the time, WWG1, WGA, which is, the hashtag that is the rallying cry of digital soldiers associated with the QAnon movement. It actually comes from a movie called White Squall. I think it was 1996. It was not a very well-known or very big movie, but the plot involves a family of 8, who go out on a sailing venture and get caught up in a major storm, and their leadership is tested by this white squall storm. So again, it's kind of in keeping with the storm theme that's part of the QAnon mythos.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else have any other questions? No? All right, then is there anything you would like to close with, Candace? Any books, podcasts, radio shows you'd like to promote, anything like that?
Well, definitely, if you're following this phenomenon, I think one of the best reporters out there who is really doing a great job of tracking this is Will Sommer, and he is at the Daily Beast. He has just done phenomenal work to kind of just, trace the day by day. And as I mentioned, my colleagues Mia Bloom and Sophia Moskalenko have this book out called Pastels and Pedophiles Inside the Mind of QAnon. That's a very new book that's out. And then I'm just going to post in the chat here. I think I've managed to copy it. Here's a link to my piece that you guys can pick up that I just did in The Intercept. It was published last month, actually, early this month, actually. And I think it'll give you kind of a snapshot. And I hope to be doing a little bit more work on this in the future. Check out New America, which is newamerica.org, and try and follow us as we proceed with our continuing investigations into QAnon and to the events of January 6th, and keep up the conversation because it's important.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to thank you for bringing this before us. It was intriguing. It was interesting. It was compelling. It makes me want to watch the shows and read the things. So thank you for that. As always, I wish to thank everyone for coming that is a member of HSGP. Remember, if you liked our content, please hit the subscribe button. Feel free to contribute to our Patreon, become a member of HSGP, or better yet, volunteer to make the magic happen. With that, be well, stay safe, and take care, HSGP. And
Before you take off, is there